You are listening to the North American Kings podcast, your traditional masculinity training ground. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski, founder of North American Kings LLC, a leadership development company based in Cincinnati, Ohio. As we all know, the man brand has taken an absolute beating over the past few decades, and it's our mission to change that. We're going to do that by helping you join the fight to reclaim traditional masculine values. Welcome to headquarters. Training starts now. Welcome back to the training ground, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski. We've got a great episode planned for you today. Now, hopefully it will reveal some things to you that you will not be able to unsee once we unpack them. So let's get started. I want to thank our friends at Naked Armor Razors and Wet Shave Gear for their continued support of this show. Single-bladed razors went by the wayside for a long while in modern culture. Someone got it in their head that multi-bladed razors were safer to use and provided a closer, better shave. Then why, after 20 years of shaving, am I just finding out that everything I knew about shaving was a lie? Naked Armor Razors set me on the right path to the smoothest, highest quality shave I've ever had. And they can do that for you. Right now, my listeners can get 15% off of anything in their online store by going to nakedarmorrazors.com and entering coupon code KINGS15 at checkout. Don't wait to start enjoying the highest quality shave you'll ever give yourself. nakedarmorrazors.com. So, what is normal? I want to launch this episode by saying that this is one of the most basic and refutable philosophical arguments that I've ever heard, and that you will continue to hear from the amateur philosopher who's trying to justify his deviant or abnormal behavior to himself and to you. This I've heard thousands of times in the 20 years that I've been doing this. Or not this, but coaching people and living. But we hear this often, and it's a dumb argument. And if people continue to make it, like, we need to point that out. Writ large, end of story, right? So I'm going to pose this possible definition. Normal is a measure of our proximity to a pure truth on a given subject. Cool? Everybody got that? Normal is a measure of how close we are to the actual truth on one topic or another. Like, what is real? Normal. What is the desired outcome? It sounds super clinical, right? And I intended to be. But in thinking about this definition, I wanted to encompass the fact that normal is, in part, subjective. There's a pure truth, but there's also, again, caveats. It's very different for a lot of situations. But there are waypoints of certainty that we can use to navigate the many states of normal that we're going to be asked to evaluate in a given day. Hey, what's normal for breakfast? What's a normal TV show to play for your kids on a Saturday morning? Like, what is it? What is normal? Right? And there are going to be these things that we touch on multiple times a day. And however we navigate that path is going to be evident to us. So, of course, the more narrow the truth statement, the more specific and therefore limited our range of perception must be on that given subject. So if I say, this mug is red, well, that's a normal statement, that I have a hot coffee mug or whatever like that. But again, it's subjective. Whatever I say about this particular coffee mug is going to ultimately be, the truth of the matter, or the normalcy of the situation, as narrow as that is, must be limited to the subject matter right here. Right? That statement's going to be about that particular coffee mug. That affects nothing in the real world, right? But that's how specific and that's how narrow the truth statement and the normalcy of the situation could be. So I hope I put that in perspective. There are elements to normal that we'll be discussing today. And I'm going to tee up the foundation of truth first. And then we're going to discuss what falsehoods men and young boys are being asked to swallow that should be absolutely avoided. And I mean to the point of risking the ire of people at work and at home. Okay? Like we're going to touch on, we're going to get a little personal. All right, so forgive me on this. So this subject will branch out in a ton of different ways, so stay with me. I've done the very best I can to level it out. So first, I want to outline that there's normal and abnormal. All right, seems obvious. But what we're going to tackle first, is that absolute perceived normal versus actual norm. And the reason we want to do that is because we're going to be tripping up early if we don't begin on the right step, and then it's going to be difficult for us to catch up later. So we're going to be pivoting to some more categorical stuff in a little bit. So first, normal is somewhat of a construct. We know this. This is not there's no denying that there's an environmental factor to normal, what makes up normal. However, normal doesn't necessarily mean correct. This is where we get into perceived versus actual norm. And this sets up the greater argument that there is an objective normal rather than this cultural relativism. Everything's normal if we just make it normal. Now, there's a process to make it normal. We'll touch on that soon, but we're going to start here at the very basics. There is perceived normal, and then there's actual or real norms. An example that I discuss in production and in the CI world is the gradual acceptance of machine defects. Okay, so think business. I'm operating a machine that picks up, that takes up this computer and moves it. All right, and it happens. So that machine is designed to do one thing. I had an operator for a company that I worked for early in my career. Now, this is a real world example. This actually happened. I was new and I was getting used to looking at downtime and other data. And in order to direct my efforts in the plant, right, I have to take data from a supervisory or management of operations standpoint, and my job is to look at the data, see where there might be problems, and then I can actually go out to the plant and see where those things are happening and make improvements and affect downtime and plant performance, and that's how you become a good supervisor and leader. So I noticed that we were getting nickel and dimed by some strange downtime code to the tune of like 30 minutes a shift. Right? That's an hour and a half a day. It's not a ton, but it's still it's not a small amount either when looked at in a collaborative like bunch. So I noticed that we were getting nickel and dimed. There were, these are considered minor stops, which are incidents of downtime that last less than 10 minutes every time they happen, per incident. Now, they're not big hitters, and they often go unnoticed for this reason. Minor stops are important on morale for a plant because ultimately it's our operators that deal with these directly. If your machine jams and you have to deal with that, like an operator doesn't call maintenance to handle that. They open up a door, they pull out whatever is jammed up in the machine, they close the doors, they reset all the safeties, they turn the machine on, and they keep going. Well, that took 2 minutes, right? But outside of that, no one notices it. And the reason is because it's just perceived as normal operation. However, what caused that jam to happen? Right? So that's a minor stop. Anyway, I didn't know what this particular code that I had discovered was. And being on third shift, there's not a lot of people that you can really ask. So naturally, I wandered down to the actual equipment where the operator was, and I asked him. Now, when questioned, the operator said, well, wait a minute, I'll show you. So we waited. Now, sure enough, after a few minutes of some small talk and just waiting, the machine stopped. The employee brought me over to this heat tunnel, and I watched him. He pressed 2 buttons, just click, click. After a minute, the machine kind of homed itself a little bit, and it kicked right back in and started again. Now, I asked him how many times a night that he had done that. And of course, time is relative. So he gave me a vague guess of how long he really was down all day or how many times it happened in a shift, and it was less than the real number. So what he did tell me is that he had been doing this for years. Okay, so it turns out that it was a faulty relay or something very simple that needed to be fixed, but it needed to be opened up. Like, it wasn't like something an operator could fix. It was something that we needed to go and target and do, but it was relatively cost effective to just fix it. So a work order was placed or was never put in place, like when this was originally discovered, or an employee figured out how to reset this and never escalated the issue to management. Right? Hey, why deal with management when I can just press these 2 buttons? Downtime is, it was 2 minutes. Who cares? Right? Time flies when you're having fun, right? 2 minutes doesn't seem like a lot of time. Well, that or management had never looked at the data in that way before, and they wouldn't have known to track it down. So a lot of things can happen in this situation. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody. The point is, for years, the fix for this was to push those 2 buttons, and that became the way forward. And that fix to an abnormal situation became the norm. That became normal, and that was trained to new people as the way to do business, on this particular piece of equipment. So this fix saved hours of running per month with one simple fix. Now, recognizing that normal should be questioned causes some of this. Now, I'm looking at data because I just happen to be a data guy, and I see these things, I ask the questions, and I didn't take no for an answer. I didn't say, I just pressed these 2 buttons. Well, that's not the root cause. That's not the deepest you can go in that situation. You have to ask, well, why do I need to press those 2 buttons? Then we start to ask real questions. We question what normal is. Actual versus perceived. Perceived might be correct, but looking deeper will show you whether it's confirmed or not. In this case, I questioned the perceived norm, and turns out it wasn't normal. Now, this one case is where we can say that there's an absolute norm. Like, this kind of proves the point. The machine runs as designed. Any deviation from that is a departure, however small, from the desired state. Now, back to our definition. There is a pure truth attached to normal, limited, bang, to this small, narrow machine. This small definition of normal. If we can learn to spot these things, we can then look to see, hey, that's that. Let's question that normal. Oh, it's not normal. Let's fix that, and boom, it's fixed. And now we become more agile in our adaptation to the real world. So there are 2 kinds of abnormal. Now there's the perceived normal, right? And it's not the real normal. It's perceived normal. So it's perceived. Whether it's right or wrong, we'll find out. So if we discover an abnormality, it's going to be one of 2 things. It's going to be benign or destructive. Now, I would say malignant, but I don't want this to get confused by some algorithm on Google for like a medical definition. It's not. So we're gonna say benign or safe or destructive. Okay. Now, benign is like shaving with a straight razor. When I just mentioned that, but it's against perceived norms. Like, I should be using a multi-bladed razor from a big company that I can get at any store, and I'm going to shell out more money every week or month because I've got to buy all these disposable razors, where I could have, this more expensive but razor I'm going to have forever, and I'm going to take care of it, and I'm going to get a better shave. The perceived this is a perceived abnormality. It's not the normal way of things. That's a benign abnormality. It doesn't hurt anybody. It's limited in scope. It only affects me, but also there's no damage done to me in the practice of this abnormality. But it is abnormal. Let's call that what it is. I think it's for the better, but right now it's not generally accepted by the masses, so this thing will become and stay, it's still abnormal. So let's move to destructive abnormalities. And I could talk to you about critical race theory. I could talk to you about this big thing we're going to talk about in just a second. But no, right now we are going to discuss something that's becoming far more prevalent, and it's slower than some of this other stuff that we're talking with culturally. But it's still a matter that it's still confused today. Now, I want to talk about right now for men, dating women with STDs. Seems sensitive. I'm sorry. And if I offend anybody who's listening to this, I'm kind of sorry. Like, I don't mean to offend you, but this is the real situation, okay? And you're either going to get a wake-up call or you're going to hate me forever. I'm okay with either one, okay? So I've had this conversation on multiple occasions in person, and it drives me absolutely bonkers. Almost to the point of anger. Now, this is why normalization of destructive abnormalities should be stopped with brutal efficiency. Dating women with STDs, or dating anybody with an STD, is a destructive abnormality. Dating women with sexually transmitted diseases is something that will continue to come up in the post-sexual revolution era. Where sex is relatively unrestricted, you naturally get riskier behavior, which is largely correlated with the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. It's a fact. So let's address the abnormality beyond that free love is healthy, right? We will spend, guys, normal for us, or it's being sold to us that free love and guys need to go out there and sow their wild oats, that the perception there is that that's normal. It might be normal, might not be correct. All right, and we can talk about that in detail in another issue. I want to address this one very specifically. I've been asked by friends, and I've stumbled upon this conversation in public. Guys start seeing, this girl. Some time goes by, and now it's starting to get to the point where the relationship is starting to get physical. Their relationships at that point. Assuming that she tells you, which is no guarantee with either STDs or birth control for that matter, you've got a choice to make. So after a few months or even years into a relationship, if it hasn't come up beforehand, which likely won't because it's embarrassing, right? Now you've hopefully built up some attachment to this woman that you're with. Is that attachment worth your sexual health? The answer, ladies, gentlemen, and boys, the answer is no. It is not worth it. Okay? Now, the repercussions are enormous. So let's state the obvious for a second. Some STDs are physically difficult to live with. They can be painful. They can require odd treatments. They can also leave you debilitated and even dead, eventually. Right? Now, the most common one that comes up with that in this conversation, let's take genital herpes, because it does come up a lot. I've had this conversation again multiple times, and it's frustrating because of the simplicity of this. It's permanent. You guys, we didn't talk about something that goes away like gonorrhea or something like that. Like, if it happens, great. Good for you. You went out, you gambled, and you lost. Okay, but outside of maybe some complications, like the clap goes away. Herpes is permanent. Not to quote a line from a very popular movie. It's permanent. So there's no cream that's going to fix that. It's painful. On guys, it's obvious, and it makes our equipment look awful. But in women, it's generally internal and thusly almost invisible. She might know. You probably won't. So here's the kicker. It's only contagious when someone's having an outbreak. Now, that's the piece that gets unsuspecting guys. That is the piece that keeps you on the hook. It's quote-unquote manageable. Now, this is where the risk comes in. Overconfidence is something that men need to wrestle with. We are risk takers. And it's been there for time and time before time was time. When something is manageable, especially when it's our favorite treat, we're likely to take that risk. And we do it all the time. Men are risk takers. It's in our nature. So gentlemen, this is not worth it. If you've been told that she's got an STD that's permanent and can affect you permanently, It is not worth it. Think with your brains, not equipment. Unless you've already had unprotected relations with this woman and think you've got it, respectfully end things. She'll understand. She's not going to be happy about it, but that's her reacting to your rejection of the situation. I mean, and it's her. Unfortunately, but she will understand. That shouldn't be a shock to her. And if it is a shock to her, you run for the hills. And the reason I say that is because she's accepted something that's so abnormal and has processed it in a way that makes you the bad guy for looking out for your own well-being. If she's angry that you want to end it because of that, or even if she thinks she's got it, God, I mean, there have been situations that I've heard of where someone thinks they have something and they tell their partner right away, things break off, and then it turns out the test came back negative or something like that. Well, great. Get back together. Be a little more careful. But she should understand. That shouldn't lead to heartache, or that shouldn't lead to problems, because in a rational relationship, that's a normal decision to make. Right? So for those who have permanent sexual health issues, there are support groups, and there are even dating groups that people can join where the stigma is less and both parties are, part of this, part of that group. Right? So they're not alone either. But like any vice, there will be people who are too far gone, who will be on the other end telling you that things in their little world are great. There's a litany of bad advice out there. You judge for yourself. So I had this guy telling people that how manageable dating a woman with herpes was. And I asked him, how long have you had it? Now, it's a perfectly reasonable question. In normal conversations, convincing healthy guys to risk their sexual health on a woman who has confirmed genital herpes is absolutely asinine. Now, it's usually safe to assume that anybody doing so is justifying their own broken nature through you. Misery loves company. We know that. Now, of course, the guy caught himself. I don't have it. He said his partner, so not married, who he has a son with, has herpes, and they've been together for a while, and they're doing just fine. He doesn't have it. At least that's what he's saying. So he's either lying, or it's two things. So one, she either brought her kid to the relationship and they're dealing with something that she had previously. We'll come back to that. Or second, she cheated on him and he decided to stay together and they're dealing with it. Now, and that's fine. But back to the first thing before we get to the punchline here. How desperate were you to settle for a woman with a child from a previous relationship who came to your partnership with genital herpes? Guys, settling generally works out for people. The idea is to settle for someone who is as close to what you think can be perfect. And, some people get closer than others, but it does work out. But gentlemen, you can do better than a woman with a kid who has genital herpes coming into your new relationship. Now, this goes for women too. A guy wanders into your relationship, ladies, with no job, a kid who he has partial custody of, and genital herpes. Are you going to jump in bed with that? The answer in a normal world is absolutely no. Now, in either case, this situation, as described, is anything but normal. It's certainly not something to encourage. Like, even guys who find themselves in this situation should realize that this is not something that should be encouraged. Encouraging behavior implies a desired outcome. No one wants this. So, anyone listening to this is an example of a perceived norm. Okay? To this person I was talking to, it's perceived that it's normal to engage in that type of risky behavior. I'm here to tell you it's absolutely not. It's normal to be kind and accepting of people for who they are. Generally, that's true with some obvious exceptions. However, morphing this into being so accepting that you find it necessary to expose yourself to STDs to maintain that level of accepting of people around you is abnormal. It's distancing yourself from the truth of a situation, thereby becoming less normal the further and further down that rabbit hole you get. For every dude I've had this talk with, and it is a plurality, thank you for making this conversation possible, and I hope that your equipment is still clean. Another example of destructive abnormality that is actively being pushed down our throats. Drag queen story hour. Going through the normalization process as well. This one is, we're all old enough to remember, I think. So this started back in 2015 and guess where? San Francisco, of course, right? Like it would be. But that's right, San Francisco is where Drag Queen Story Hour was born. Activist Michelle T, I believe I'm pronouncing that correct, who identifies as queer, thought the story hours at her local library were too, quote-unquote, heteronormative. So she worked within her community and arranged for story hours to be held by drag queens from the area so that the events would be more inclusive and affirming to the LGBTQ families. Of course, the usual players were outraged, and in my opinion, rightly so. Now, this has nothing to do with how I feel about the LGBTQ folks as people. However, it is abnormal. Hence the word queer in the Q in LGBTQ. Queer literally means differing in some ways from what is usual or normal. And that's from Merriam-Webster. So we're going to get back to this drag queen story thing in a second. So in a book called The Marketing of Evil, How Radicals, Elitists, and Pseudo-Experts Sell Us Corruption Disguised as Freedom by David Kupelian, he discussed the normalization strategies used by the LGBTQ lobby, which is arguably one of the most influential groups in American social culture. Now, this guy is a conservative Christian, so his views on homosexuality may not sit well with some folks. That's fine. I want to read this book because some of the things he discussed, like porn, he discusses the separation of church and state. There's a lot of things in that book that he goes through and identifies. I want to objectively look at the steps, the strategic steps that he outlines that I've verified that the LGBTQ lobby has used to change the minds of an entire nation. It's fascinating. And we're going to confirm it here for you today. So the LGBTQ lobby back in 1988, just for some background, in Warrenton, Virginia, they had like a war council, right? And activists Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen and many others put together this book. Well, those two wrote this book after this war council with a bunch of other activists. And the book was called After the Ball. It was their battle strategy to advance the LGBTQ lobby's future. And it was a long-term marketing plan. Now, in this book, he outlines 3 techniques that they use. The first one, it's called desensitization. It's a continuous flood, and in this case of gay-related advertising, but this could be anything, right? This could be, and we saw this with porn and the sexualization of marketing, where you saw just nothing but scantily clad women advertising beer, alcohol, cars, you name it. So again, we're going to talk about some very specific things because I want to quote what he's said in the book, but apply these to anything you want. They are relatively the same. So again, desensitization, continuous flood of related advertising put out in the least offensive way as possible so that the abnormality, and in this case, gets easier to swallow. Okay? And a quote from the actual book, After the Ball, if straights can't shut off the shower, they may at least eventually get used to being wet. So if marketers continue past the point where the abnormality being pushed is viewed as tiresome, people eventually just accept it. They start shrugging it off. They're like, oh, okay, there's another ad. There's another example. There's another thing. At this point, people stop resisting and accept through inaction the abnormality. Okay, so that's the first step. The second technique is called jamming, and this is a tool meant to silence the expression or even the support for dissenting opinions on the matter. So we have forcing exposure to the abnormality, then we squash anyone who dares question whether the abnormal subject matter should be as prevalent as it is, or should that be normalized. We're going to go over some examples shortly, but you guys, if you're paying attention to the world out there, the last 5-6 years, this is not a new concept. Okay? So the last step is conversion. Now, this is the transformation of public sentiment. Through propaganda, marketing material, through lies, or even reassociations, regardless of truth, the perception of what was once normal is now either associated with things that are bad, or they use that momentum and kind of swing it back around. This is also where people who don't have access to credible information, they tend to fall in. The quote-unquote uneducated voter who accepts a lie at face value because it's the only thing they've ever heard. Now, we've all heard this before. Repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth. That was a quote from Joseph Goebbels from the SS, like the Jew hunter from Inglourious Bastards. You guys remember that movie? It was a great movie, and it was played phenomenally by all the actors and actresses involved. But that's actually quoting Vladimir Lenin too. So we have the Soviet revolutionist, and we've got the Jew hunter from Hitler's SS who were saying, if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. So that is a tactic that can be used and is being used to put forth a lot of differing ideas. Now, consequently enough, this is a technique that I just used in conversion in the very last sentence. The quote, its sources, they're absolutely true, but I'm associating with people I disagree with. Or again, by associating with people that you disagree with, a group or person that carries a negative connotation. Call it reassociation, call it whatever. It's persuasive to its core, which is why it's used. The thing about it is that it's very easy to see if you're looking for it, right? So if this got brought up a lot, where people don't like socialized medicine for whatever their reasons, and they say, "Hey, Hitler had Hitler and the Nazis used socialized medicine." Well, that's not why we hated them. It's not necessarily the best idea, socialized medicine, in my opinion. But the reason I don't like it is not because the Nazis used it, but to say that is attempting to get people to see it as a bad thing because of who used to use it, if that makes any sense, right? But now that we know to look for it, we know that that's a frivolous argument. That was an argument made to play on emotions rather than the actual efficacy of an idea. All right. So the LGBTQ lobby did this a while back when they started claiming that that famous individuals in the past were secretly gay. They did this when there was no evidence. There was no way to refute it. So why not just say it over and over and over again to sway the hearts and minds of people that didn't agree with them at the time? So this book goes through a very thorough explanation of several of these cultural phenomena. So it's not just, again, the LGBTQ lobby. It's a good read. It's something to listen to. If we can take the emotion out of the subject matter, there are startling parallels that we can learn about, and we can see them happening today. The sexualization of our children is a huge problem in the world long term, and here in America, we can see this same process repeating itself. So back to Drag Queen Story Hour. It's following the exact same pattern. Not the exact same people are doing this, although there might be some crossover. But here's the problem. It's the usual players freak out, right? Drag Queen Story Hour starts. You've got your conservative Christians, your anti-abortion people, your anti-gay activists. You've got all these people who usually freak out. That's the problem. It's the usual cultural fighters. And in some cases, they do get annoying. The problem is, on this one, it was just the usual fighters. It was not moms and dads in the communities where this was being done. Parents actually took their kids to these events to expose them to a part of the world that they shouldn't have any part in childhood development. Then they spread it to other progressive cities. There's like drag queen story hours starting to pop up everywhere. At the same time, the culture is fighting about who can intervene if a kid says they're transgender. Like what happens if the mom and dad disagree? When this happens, there's a particular, when this happened, there was a particular video that went viral where an 11-year-old kid dresses up in drag and does a show to fawning adults who are throwing dollar bills at him. Now, in each one of these stories is, it's accompanied by a shit mother who is facilitating this and a weak father who's staring at the camera because they're doing an interview with this, like it's 60 Minutes. And he's staring at the camera and he's got a look on his face like he can't believe it. He's even here. Now, that man is failing at every level to provide, protect, and teach his family. Now, if this kid is going through some inner turmoil, that's fine. And I'm not saying that that's not real. There are ways to work through that in a healthy way, however you want to do it. But letting them dress in drag to perform for adults is not one of them. Let's be clear. Working through your emotions and your mental state or whatever your transition is, sexualizing yourself to adults and doing drag queen kid show is not the healthy or right or just way to treat kids, one, to let kids do. So we've got not just the kids that are doing this, but we've got the parents that are letting it happen. And we've got adults that are participating. This is ridiculous. And it just escalated this week. It's Pride Month. Yay, more months. Whatever. I guess every month is like straight white guy month. So what do I have to complain about, I guess? But Nickelodeon just aired children's programming featuring the dogs from Blue's Clues and a drag queen named Nina West singing to kids about being true to the person that they are on the inside. So we've got more desensitization, and you see this everywhere. You can't see a rainbow these days without deciding whether or not it's meant to be just a rainbow or it's a statement of pride. Characters in shows now have to be some sort of intersectional box checker to even get cast on a show. I don't want to say how ridiculous that is, but I keep saying we're being exposed to this. The flood is coming. Again, to quote the very beginning, if we can't get out of the shower, you might as well get used to it. Well, that's what we're being asked to do. And you'll see jamming on this, any day of the week. You just turn on the news. When someone disagrees with the prevailing direction of the progressive left or, the direction of the company or whatever, you're going to see people vilifying that person. It's the new norm now. That Colorado baker who's been target sued 1,000 times for not making custom cakes that clash with his religion is a prime example. Now, this episode may not make the rounds because it ascribes a different opinion. I'm okay with that. I've got ways around that. And you've got conversion, the propaganda arm of these groups constantly pumping this subject matter over the media. You've got cuties on Netflix, drag queens on primetime children's channels, and it's all meant to get us to accept the abnormal. So why go through all this? If you recognize the steps that are being taken in order to manipulate the public through this, or the thought on this, you will be less likely to accept things at face value. Evaluate principles based on empirical truth and make your own decisions. I continue to say this. Great fighters recognize in their opponents things that they would do and that they would fall prey to. right? This goes for martial combat. This goes for chess. Putting yourself in their perspective will allow you to see your openings, your weaknesses, and will allow you to improve. Now, once you know what your opponent is likely to use against you, you can prepare yourself and counter it. This fight is already happening with regards to masculinity. How many TV shows, comic books, novels all have major male characters who cast masculinity in a negative light? They're making it normal to see. It's desensitization. Man, I'm sorry about that. Even on Modern Family, again, I know this is maybe an old reference, but Phil, the young straight dad, he's a great guy. He's got a gorgeous wife, but there are tons of examples where he is less masculine than normal. Again, it's desensitization. We're taking a good guy that we want to like, and they're making it normal for him to have these feminine traits. Moving on, they made Thor a woman. Any Marvel fans out there? Yes, that happens in the comic books, and that's the new way of Marvel. The new Iron Man is a girl, although this one was done far more tastefully. So, how many others are we going to see where men acting feminine is the preferred state that our detractors want us to believe? They want us to accept this. This is another example of a destructive abnormality, and they're doing a great job of making us think that this is normal. They're selling it very well, and they're selling it to men. Now, unfortunately, there are men out there who would rather live in that state than become more masculine. However, they'll begin to experience life like this. They'll hate it, and then they're going to start behaving in toxic ways that will eventually get attributed to real men elsewhere. It's a brilliant ploy, and it happens in warfare all the time. Misdirection, getting your opponents to blame you or blame a third party for something that you did. Right? We must accept jamming. Like, that's going to happen, right? Like, I'm fine being called a misogynist. Why? Because the women that are actually in my life can tell you otherwise, even with all my faults. Now, I'm being called, I'm going to be called a homophobe probably for this episode, right? Particularly for this segment that we just got done with. That's fine, because it's not the people who are gay or even them being gay that I have a problem with. It's how it's being presented to kids. And again, sexualizing our kids and getting them to confront these things too early is destructive. I would rather be called all the phobes out there than allow that to go unrestricted or unchallenged. It's destructive. It affects our kids. It's going to affect the future state of our culture. I would rather say something now to the risk of nothing than allow that to happen. So stay tuned for the rest of this piece, because this is where most people do the majority of their interacting. Okay? Having a clear understanding of this will allow you to use your background information and will provide today in order to properly defend yourselves when you're out in public. So here's an academic article from Implementation Science by Carl R. May and about a dozen other authors, titled "The Development of a Theory of Implementation and Integration, Normalization Process Theory," or NPT, Normalization Process Theory. From the paper, Normalization Process Theory explains how new technologies, ways of acting, and ways of working become routinely embedded in everyday practice and has applications in the study of implementation processes. Listen to all these three parallels. Again, 3 steps. Implementation, by which we mean, the article, we mean the social organization of bringing a practice or practices into action. The second thing, embedding, by which we mean the processes through which a practice or practices become, or do not become, routinely incorporated in everyday work of individuals or groups. Third, integration, by which we mean the processes by which a practice or practices are reproduced and sustained among the social matrices of an organization or institution. In summary, I'm still quoting, it is postulated that 1, practices become routinely embedded or normalized in social contexts as the result of people working individually and collectively to enact them. The work of enacting a practice, 2, is promoted or inhibited through the operations of generative mechanisms, coercive, cognitive participation, collective action, or reflexive monitoring, through which human agency is expressed. Number 3, the production of and reproduction of a practice requires continuous investment by agents and ensembles of action that are carried forward in time and space. This perfectly and empirically supports what we discussed in the first segment. A process, in that case through marketing of an idea, by which things become systemically normalized. Okay? Look, think back on that. We need people to actively go out there and do stuff. And then they need to control how we function through either acceptance or through jamming. So, hey, like, we're going to coerce you into doing this. We're going to publicly vilify you if you don't. We're going to dox you. We're going to do all these things if you do not accept the norm. And then there's going to be that constant propaganda piece, that jumping in and hearing this litany of you're a good person if you accept these abnormal things, or you're a bad person if you disagree or even question them. You're a Nazi, you're a hater, you're a Klansman, you're whatever. That's the way things go. So what can we do to stop the normalization of abnormality? This is what I want to leave you with. This is something we need to do. Now, number 1, this is going to come out of left field, but first, we must monitor our language. Now, we didn't talk about this up in the previous steps because, 1, I want you all to recognize what it is. All right? Now, Michael Knowles has a book coming out called Speechless: Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. I can't wait to read this, but the premise is that people change how words are used. And when they do that, we subtly change the definition. Okay? And when we change the definition, we're talking about the subject matter. So how we talk about one thing will affect our perception of what that thing is. So when we do this, we're allowing a change in perception based on how we practice our communication. Now, we can see this in modern culture. For example, Fox News article, which will be in the show description, on October 14th, 2020, Merriam-Webster changes the definition of sexual preference. Now, they did it at a really, really poignant time, and I'll get to that in a second, but it used to be a synonym for sexual orientation. And that's how it was used by Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett before she was she used it before she was confirmed to the Supreme Court, and she used it during the actual confirmation hearing. So it used to be a synonym for one thing, but during the confirmation hearing, Merriam-Webster decides they want to change the rules of the game. So the day of, they changed the definition. And I'll get to that in just a second. But the premise of the book is that these things are done intentionally. In this case, it seems to be the case. The change was to actively say that the term sexual preference, as used to refer to sexual orientation, is widely considered offensive in its implied suggestion that a person can choose who they are sexually or romantically attracted to. That's from the Merriam-Webster website. So that's not my interpretation of it. Like, that's what they said, quote unquote. And I want to bring this up. Like, what can we do to stop the normalization of the abnormal? We do not participate in these changes. Implied choice in this use of sexual preference? No. We don't need to accept that. If sexual orientation isn't a choice, then I have no choice but to be attracted to women. Fair? Now, it's still my preference to have physical relations with women, regardless of whether or not it's a choice. I would very much not prefer to have relations with men. End of story. So participating in these changes, however subtle they may be or they may not be, we are accepting them if we participate. Now, I bring that up and it seems like, it might feel like it's a cop-out or it's a cheap trick, but it's, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If it works for me, and it must work for the other side and vice versa. And I continue to say that because it proves that we do not need to participate. If somebody says, hey, that's offensive, no, it's not. Or it's just offensive to you. But what did I say? I said I prefer to have, it's my sexual preference to like women. Well, that implies choice. No, it doesn't. All it does is say that if given the choice, I'm going to choose whatever I happen to choose. If that's not a choice of mine, I'm still going to choose that. I could choose that or nothing. I could go and have physical relations with a man despite that not being my chosen preference, right? So the reason I'm saying all this is because participation is not a requisite to function in society. They may make you think that, or they may say that. It doesn't make it true. So this goes into the second thing that we can do to combat this phenomenon. Recognizing the jamming and the scare tactics and the militant nature of our detractors, and we must hold the line. I'm all right with cancel culture when the right things are canceled. Now, McCarthyism, which was, almost a militant conservatism that happened back during the Cold War, that wasn't a problem. It wasn't the problem that people make it out to be. He's vilified right now because he hunted communists within our own government. Now, it might seem like really bad back then. It doesn't seem so bad right now because they're everywhere and they're telling you that they're democratic socialists or whatever, right? But at the time, they were hunting communists, like red state communists. That is, government officials who at that point were actively helping out the Russians during an arms race against our national interests during a Cold War that was likely to lead to actual nuclear launches. All of that. We had actual people helping the enemy. So you hear McCarthyism now and you're told that he wasn't tolerant of, socialist ideas. No. I mean, you say it how I first described. He was hunting people who were giving information to an active enemy of the state during the Cold War. That presents these things in a very different and very poignant light. You can only be canceled if you let them cancel you. This is where we need to be collective in our action. If we don't accept someone being canceled, they can't be, whoever that is. If you see a guy who's called a racist and he's not, defend him or her or whoever, to that person or to the person complaining or to even HR. If somebody calls you a racist, be like, no, I'm not. You're using that word and you either don't know what it means or you're doing it to be a liar. That again, of course, assuming you've not done something racist, right? So Governor Andrew Cuomo is killing this example, right? He's doing it. He's actively being accused of sexual harassment in the workplace, in government. There were varying stories. There were pictures of this. And regardless of I'm going to say this. I don't like the guy, but regardless of the details or the very real motives behind the push, he's fighting it. He's refusing to be canceled. He's proving that it works. He'll probably still be governor at the end of this. So once we are capable of taking the jamming, the names, the active not participating, the actively not participating in the butchering of our language, step 3 of the MPT disruption is very simple. Okay? Actively, and that's the key, actively take away your support for companies or people who spread these lies or promote these unhealthy ideas. Coke went woke. We remember that. And immediately, like the day after, or 2 days after, they immediately saw a stock price hit, and it cost them $23.6 million. Within a week, they reversed course, and they're not signing these Georgia state legislature laws or whatever. Again, they immediately reverse course. They say, hey, this anti-white training that they were going to do is not really ours. And immediately they reversed course, and people started buying their product again. They saw a $23.6 million hit. Like, that's not peanuts. Now, it works when we actively move our money or actively change our behaviors and not support these folks. Now, lastly, when something is abnormal, but it's being pushed as a pure truth, we need to say stuff. It's as simple as saying, hey, don't tell me that that's normal. You're trying to have us accept the results of a broken thing or a broken system or a broken situation or machine or whatever it's supposed to be. You're trying to get us to accept that broken system as the way that things are supposed to be. We should probably fix the thing that's broken before accepting the whole new way of operating. Right? And you'll see their true colors pop up here. You know, if somebody accepts that and like, oh, okay, I must have been wrong, fine. But if they give you that look and they double down and press the lie, now you have the measure of them. Now, what will you do when you see it? That's our show, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Glenn Kowalski. Thank you very much for tuning in. Now, if you like this episode, please subscribe and follow us for free. We're on Apple Podcast, Rumble, YouTube, and wherever else you enjoy your podcast. Also, give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe as well. Good luck out there.